και κύριοι, καλησπέρα μας όλους. Εκ μέρους του Διοικητικού Συμβουλίου του Σωματείου Αδούλωτη Κερύνεια, καλωσορίζω στην Κύπρο τον διαπρέποντα συμπατριώτη μας του εξωτερικού, κύριο Κλέαρχο Κυριακίδη. Κλέαρχε, καλώς όρισες, χαιρόμαστε που είσαι μαζί μας και τον καλωσορίζουμε και τον ευχαριστούμε που συμμερίστηκε τις ανησυχίες και τους προβληματισμούς μας σε μια σύντομη συνάντηση μαζί του πριν μερικούς μήνες και μπήκε στον κόπο να ετοιμάσει την απόψινή παρουσίαση στην προσπάθεια να μας τροφοδοτήσει με νέα και πρόσθετα επιχειρήματα στην απεγνωσμένη μας προσπάθεια να πείσουμε ηγεσία και λαό ότι συζητώντας για λύση της ζωνικής δικοινοτικής ομοσπονδίας περπατάμε λάθος δρόμο και ότι επιβάλλεται να αλλάξουμε πολιτική επαναφέροντας το Κυπριακό στη σωστή του βάση ως θέμα εισβολής και κατοχής που είναι. Λόγω του περιορισμένου χρόνου που προσφέρεται για τη διοργάνωση και του γεγονότος ότι επιβαλλόταν η διάλεξη να γίνει στα αγγλικά, απεφασίστη να κάνουμε κι εμείς κάτι το οποίο δεν έχουμε ξανακάνει. Εμείς ήμασταν πάντα των ανοιχτών συγκεντρώσεων. Έτσι για απόψε η εκδήλωση μας είναι αυτού του κύκλου, στο οποίο εκλήθηκαν ακαδημαϊκοί, δικηγόροι, αναλυτές, φοιτητές, βουλευτές και εκπρόσωποι όλων των κοινοβουλευτικών κομμάτων και το Υπουργείο Εξωτερικών για να κάνουμε ένα πρώτο προβληματισμό στη βάση που θα καταθέσει ο αγαπητός Κλέαρχος. Αυτό γίνεται με τη διαβεβαίωση ότι το θέμα θα ξανατεθεί σε ανοιχτές συγκεντρώσεις από τον Σεπτέμβριο, όταν ελπίζουμε ο αγαπητός Κλέαρχος θα προσφέρεται για το σκοπό αυτόν. Χαιρετίζω τους παρόντες και να αναφέρω ότι εδώ μαζί μας εκπροσωπούνται τα κόμματα Συναγερμός, ΔΙΚΟ, ΕΔΕΚ, Νέοι Ορίζοντες, Συμμαχία Πολιτών, Ευρωπαϊκό Κόμμα, Ευρωκό. Το εκπρόσωπος του Συναγερμού, σαν να μην το βλέπω, εδήλωσε να παρευρεθεί εκ μέρους του Προέδρου κ. Αβέροφ. Ελπίζω να έρθει. Το ΑΚΕΛ δεν ούτε καν ανταποκρίθη τηλεφωνικά. Οφείλω να τα αναφέρω για σκοπούς τάξης. Ο κύριος Κουλίας είναι πάντα παρόν και δεν χρειάζεται καν να αναφερθώ στον άνθρωπο που πρωτοστατεί στους αγώνες που κάνουμε. Και τον συγχαίρουμε και τον ευχαριστούμε. Το ίδιο και τον αγαπητό μας Νίκο, τον Κουτσού, ο οποίος παρά τα προβλήματα υγείας με τα οποία ατύχησε τον τελευταίο καιρό, είναι πάντα παρόν, διαυγής, το πιο ευχάριστο για όλους μας και έτοιμος με απόψεις και θέσεις. Και ο Γιαννάκης ο Μάτσης, σίγουρα, ο οποίος πρωτοστατεί προς τις σωστές κατευθύνσεις και είναι μαζί μας. Έχει άλλον που τον εξέχασα, που δεν τον πρόσεξα, με βάση τις δηλώσεις που είχαμε, νομίζω αυτοί είμαστε. Οι υπόλοιποι ακαδημαϊκοί, δικηγόροι, σας συγχαίρω και σας ευχαριστούμε που είστε παρόντες. Ελπίζουμε να πάρουμε όλοι ερεθίσματα απόψε για να μπορέσουμε να συντονίσουμε αγώνα πιο δυνατόν περαιτέρω όλοι μαζί σαν μια γροθιά, διότι οι καιροί είναι δύσκολοι. Έρχονται χιονοστιβάδες εξελίξεων. Αγαπητέ Κλέαρχε, θα πω τίποτε παραπάνω. Καλώς όρισες στην Κύπρο.
Καλησπέρα σας. I'm going to speak in English, partly because it's the language I speak most fluently in for the moment. I'm hoping to change things in the fullness of time. But secondly, because I'm being recorded, and even though my primary objective is to address the people who've been kind enough to attend this evening, I also want to direct my attention to the diplomats, academics, politicians and others in the rest of the European Union, the United States and the rest of the world. So English will hopefully enable them to understand what is going wrong here in this small corner of the European Union. My objective today is to define, decode and deconstruct the concept known as bicommunalism. We've all studied the Cyprus question for decades, and we have tended to focus on the features of the Cyprus question that are in our face, such as the de facto partition, the question of the displaced persons and refugees, the issue of bizonality, the problems with federation. But to some extent, we seem to have overlooked what I now regard as the essence of what is wrong with Cyprus, and that is bicommunalism. And I have really two main arguments which I'm going to advance this evening. The first is that bicommunalism is unjust, and by extension it's unethical and unfair, and arguably unlawful, but there's a Security Council resolution that endorses bicommunalism, so it's very difficult to argue that it's unlawful, but I'm going to certainly argue that it's unjust, unethical and unfair. But I'm also going to try and suggest to you that it's unworkable as well. So those are my two main themes. You can see from the image that I've put at the top that the essence of bicommunalism is division. But it's much more than that. It's a legacy of Ottoman as well as British imperialism. It's a euphemism or a cloak to disguise what it really means. I'll explain what I mean by that in a moment or two. It's also what we, in the English administrative law terms, describe as irrational, or so unreasonable that no reasonable person would come up with it, because it's designed to do something that is not going to work. It's defective, it's conceptually defective. And also, and this is something that I'll try and bring across today, it's not really European. It's not really part of the liberal democratic constitutional tradition. Although Belgium is sometimes used as an absurd example of a successful or unsuccessful comparison. It's actually a terrible precedent, but we'll come to Belgium later. So it's not really European, and it undermines any real possibility of this country becoming a truly pluralist, a truly inclusive, a truly secular, liberal democracy resting under the rule of law. My conclusion is the future of Cyprus must rest on pluralism, secularism, inclusion, non-discrimination, the principle of equality, and the idea that we are all members of the liberal democratic family. Bicommunalism defeats that possibility. So that in 2 or 3 minutes is a summary of what I'm going to say. Let me now move on a little bit. I have to begin by making a declaration of interest. My declaration of interest is that I was born in the United Kingdom. I'm a British citizen, I'm a European Union citizen, and I have roots into parts of Cyprus which are now occupied by the Turkish military, the village of Bedra and the village of Lisi. And my father was educated, at least for part of his childhood, at the gymnasium in Kyrenia. So I have a declaration of interest. I also have a declaration of interest because when we had the referendum campaign in Scotland last year, I made a small contribution to the No campaign to help stop Scotland from seceding from the United Kingdom and thereby partitioning the United Kingdom. Thank you, sir. So I've got to declare that I was against the partition of the United Kingdom, and I'm now even today, against the partition of the United Kingdom. And I'm also very concerned to see what's happening in the United Kingdom, because what we've done in the United Kingdom after 1998 is that we devolved power. We took power away from Westminster and we established a Scottish Parliament and a Scottish Government, and we undermined the system of democracy that we've had for centuries, well, 300 years. And the United Kingdom managed to avoid the disaster that would have befallen it had Scotland voted to break away last autumn. But look what's happened now. The Scottish National Party has almost 100% of the seats allocated to Scotland in the Westminster Parliament because of the peculiarities of the British voting system. The Scottish National Party is in the driving seat of the Scottish Parliament and the Scottish Government. They're going after us. They want a second referendum at some point in the future. And the United Kingdom, to all intents and purposes, is disunited. And I never, ever thought that I would buy a British magazine, and I brought Prospect with me, which has referred to the British question. We've all heard about the Cyprus question, the Palestine question, the Kashmir question. Now we have the British question. And this is because the United Kingdom, back in 1998, chose to appease Scottish nationalists, surrender power from the centralised institutions of Westminster, and embark upon a constitutional experiment which has now returned to haunt the very advocates of devolution. So the United Kingdom is just about surviving, but we don't know for how much longer. And some people are saying Mr. Cameron may be the last Prime Minister of the United Kingdom in its present format. I hope not, and I will play my part, small though it will be, to try to hold the United Kingdom together and to try to put this island together as well. So let me now turn to Cyprus. And remember, Cyprus and the UK share a similarity in that they are both islands. Great Britain, rather, is an island. Cyprus is an island. What's going on in Nicosia? Well, there was a joint statement, so-called, issued in February of last year, 11th of February of 2014, by Dr. Eroglu and Mr. Anastasiadis, in which, and that's Mr. Akinci, the successor, of course, to Mr. Dr. Eroglu. The objective is that to reach a settlement as soon as possible and to hold separate simultaneous referenda thereafter. Note the word separate, because bicommunalism is predicated on separation, the separation of people, the carving up of the population into two parts. And the word separate appears in the joint statement. The settlement will be based, it says, on a bicommunal, bizonal federation with political equality as set out in the relevant Security Council resolutions and the high-level agreements, which used to be called guidelines, but have been rechristened agreements. The United Cyprus, it goes on, as a member of the UN and of the European Union, shall have a single legal personality and a single sovereignty, which is defined as the sovereignty which is enjoyed by all member states of the United Nations under the UN Charter, and which emanates equally from Greek Cypriots and Turkish Cypriots. As I will explain in a moment or two, this is the doctrine of separate but equal, which was branded as unconstitutional in the United States in the field of education as long ago as 1954. This doctrine, separate but equal, was the doctrine that was the basis of apartheid in South Africa. And it's the basis of the joint statement, and it's the basis of bicommunalism. As Americans are taught at school, you cannot be separate and equal. It's a contradiction in terms. And if you are separate, that means you are apart. And if you are apart, that means that your ideological principle is on all fours with apartheid. There's more to it than that, but I thought I'd just begin with the joint statement and build from there. Now, let's zoom in on the word bicommunalism and at the same time have regard to bizonality. It might help if we had a look at the map that was embodied within the ill-fated Annan Plan of 2004, which again I have to declare an interest here, I campaigned against from afar in the United Kingdom. By the way, I didn't have a vote in 2004 here in Cyprus. And interestingly enough, I didn't have a vote in the Scottish referendum, because one of the catastrophic mistakes Mr Cameron made as Prime Minister was that he and the British Parliament allowed Scotland to have a separate referendum and the separate right to break away from the United Kingdom without us in England or our colleagues in Wales and Northern Ireland having a say in the matter. So I don't know what's going to happen in the constitutional future of Cyprus, but do not fall into the trap that the British have fallen into of granting a part of your country the right to have a unilateral referendum. Bicommunalism. It's a euphemism. It's a cloak. It's a term that's misleading. Why is it misleading? It's misleading because it doesn't really mean the number 2 all of the time. And the same applies for bizonality. Bizonality does not really mean 2 zones. It means 4 zones. Let's be clear. If there is a settlement of the Cyprus question in accordance with what is being discussed in Nicosia, you will not end up with 2 constitutionally established zones. You will have 4 constitutionally established zones. You will have, if we use the Annan Plan terminology, a Greek Cypriot constituent state in the south, a Turkish Cypriot constituent state in the north, and you'll also have 2 British sovereign base areas, perhaps in truncated form, but you will still nonetheless have 2 sovereign base areas in the south with the stamp of approval from the electorate. So you'll end up with 4 zones. Now, I'm not here to say that the British bases should close down or change. I'm merely making the point that bizonality is a euphemism. It's a misleading term, because we're not talking about 2 zones, we're talking about 4. The same point applies to the constitutional structures that will emerge from a bicommunal and bizonal federation. You will have 2 communities with 2 zones, with 2 leaders, with 2 electoral rolls, with 2 referenda results. But you will also have a public sector serving 3 constitutions, 3 parliaments, 3 governments, 3 judiciaries, 3 offices of Attorney General, 3 offices of Auditor General, 3 ombudsmen, 3 this, 3 that, 3 the other. And throw in the British, you might have a 4th set of courts down in the sovereign base areas as well. So bicommunalism and bizonality together pervert the principles of arithmetic. Now that's okay in America or in the Russian Federation, where you have a large country and you need a federal setup. But in a small island such as Cyprus, it's absurd to carve up your constitution in this way and to have multiple layers of government. Now, I'm not a management consultant and I'm not an economist, but I've seen the disaster that's befallen the United Kingdom economically with the banking crash. I've gone enough times to Greece to see the disaster that's befallen Greece over the Eurozone disaster. And one of the lessons of recent history is that a sovereign state should have a lean, agile and cost-effective public sector. You can't have a lean, agile and cost-effective public sector with 3 parliaments, 3 governments, 3 judiciaries, and so on. And on the plane coming over, I think I read in The Spectator, there's a principle called, I think it's a variation of Parkinson's law, I think they called it. The more bureaucracy that you have, the less efficiency you have. And some of you who've worked in the Cyprus government may agree or disagree with that. But this is what you're asking for. You're asking for a bloated public sector. And who is going to pay for it? Now we come to, before we turn to the meat in the sandwich, which is the meaning of bicommunalism, I just want to say a word or two about Belgium. Belgium is often touted as the European precedent that should be used to try and inspire a settlement here in Cyprus. I understand that Mr. Erdogan, back in 2002, was a fan of the Belgian constitution and its application in some way here in Cyprus. Well, that was back in 2002. I may be wrong because I haven't seen the archives from the Annan Plan era. I don't know what's happened to the Annan Plan archives or whether they exist. But I understand from reading one or two sources that the Belgian constitution was one of those that was drawn upon to prepare the constitution, one of the three constitutions in the Annan Plan and the structures in the Annan Plan. Well, Belgium is, to all intents and purposes, a failing state. May not be a failed state, but it's certainly a failing state. It holds the world record, I understand, for not having a government. They went 541 days without a government. That was in 2010 to 2011. So I asked the question, do you really want to have Belgium as your model? Carving your population up into segments, empowering those segments, and then ending up, as that cartoon illustrates, with gridlock and constitutional turmoil. Now we come to the crux of my talk. What do we really mean by these terms that trip off the tongue of politicians, academics, diplomats, journalists, and so on? What do we mean by the two communities? What do we mean by the Greek community, which is the phrase appearing in the Constitution of the Republic of Cyprus from 1960? What do we mean by the Turkish community, which also appears in the 1960 Constitution? What do we mean by the terms bicommunal and bicommunalism? Very important questions. Let's have a look at does anybody know, by the way? Is it something that... No, what do we mean by bicommunal? And I'm not going to repeat that, but it's a very interesting word that's been used.
Has anything to do with the bisexual?
I'm not going to repeat some of these remarks, but bicommunalism is all of these terms are euphemisms. It's an English word of Greek origin. These are cloaks. Under the 1960 Constitution, which was drafted by a joint constitutional commission which included representatives from Greek, Turkey and Cyprus, the Greek community comprises all citizens of the Republic who are of Greek origin and whose mother tongue is Greek, or who share the Greek cultural traditions, or who are members of the Greek Orthodox Church. So the Greek community is a euphemism for the Greek language, Greek ethnicity, and the Greek Orthodox Church. The Turkish community means all citizens of the Republic who are of Turkish origin and whose mother tongue is Turkish, or who share the Turkish cultural traditions, or who are Muslims. So the Turkish community is a euphemism to disguise what it really means, which is the Turkish language, Turkish ethnicity, and Islam. So taken together, the Greek community and the Turkish community means, in reality, two languages, two ethnicities, and two faiths. Now that wouldn't matter. We're all Democrats here. We're all in favour of everybody having the right to speak their language, to cherish their ethnicity, and to practice their faith. But what the 1960 Constitution has done, and this is what bicommunalism does as a principle, is that it splits down the middle the citizens, and it puts them, as this room is, into two segments. You're over there because you speak Turkish and you're Muslims, and you're over here because you're Greek and you speak Greek and you're Greek Orthodox Christians. And if you're not a Turk, and if you're not a Greek, you have to opt in to one of these two if you want to be a citizen. So bicommunalism, in common with the 1960 Constitution, is what we call in England now, we didn't have this phrase in the past, and it's a wonderful phrase that we owe to Sir William Macpherson, a retired High Court judge. The 1960 Constitution and bicommunalism are institutionally racist and unwittingly racist. And what that means is that the system is geared in favour of these two communities, and if you don't happen to belong to these two communities, you are subject to the most insidious type of racism, which is institutional racism and unwitting racism. So it's a more subtle form of racism, but because it's more subtle, it's regarded as insidious, damaging and deeply immoral, and very, very damaging. And at a time when, here in the Republic of Cyprus, we have a multi-ethnic, multi-faith community in the singular, notice my choice of term, we should be embracing the diversity of the population and integrating the migrants and the refugees and the other people who've arrived here in recent years. And we should be building our constitution based on the demographic realities of the Republic of Cyprus today, not the policies of the past, which I will come to in a moment or two. So bicommunalism is a euphemism to divide or to disguise the division of people along the lines of language, ethnicity and religion. But what does that word bicommunalism mean? It's almost an ideology in the way we refer to communism or Nazism or socialism. It is in a way an ideology, but it's not defined in the Oxford English Dictionary. The word bi is defined. Bi is defined in the Oxford English Dictionary as connoting the sense that something is having or is furnished with two elements. Communalism is defined. So we have a look at, I'll explain to you what communalism means according to the Oxford English Dictionary. It offers a number of variations. Communalism is a principle or system of social organisation in which the major political units of society are local, self-governing communities. So there's an element of self-governing embodied within the definition of communalism. Secondly, communalism embodies communal living, usually with common ownership of property, and the organisation of society at the level of the community rather than the individual. Communalism gives primacy to the community rather than the individual. Western liberal democracy is predicated on us, you, the individual, the empowerment of the individual. The individual has become a consumer. We are empowered by law, by the courts, by Parliament, as citizens of a state, as individuals and as consumers. Communalism subordinates the individual to the interests of the community. And if you don't happen to be Greek or Turkish and don't fall neatly into one of those two camps, you are coerced constitutionally into one of those two camps if you want to be a citizen, and you are thereby de-individualized. I won't go as far as to say that you are dehumanized, but you are de-individualized because you are subservient to the community. The Oxford English Dictionary goes on to explain that the origin of communalism is South Asian, and it entails, this is very important, communalism owes its origins to South Asia, and it entails strong allegiance to one's own ethnic or religious group, rather than to a society or nation as a whole. And communalism is thereby associated with religious factionalism, ethnocentrism, and the structuring of society or politics is the basis of this. Now, sometimes people like me are accused of being nationalists or hardliners. It's a misleading allegation to level at me. I would suggest that bicommunalism is a euphemism, not just for two ethnicities, two languages, two faiths. Bicommunalism is also a euphemism for two forms of nationalism. And bicommunalism fuels nationalism. Do you want to see the evidence? Look at Cyprus after 1960. Look at Bosnia. Look at Northern Ireland. Look at Iraq. Look at Sudan. Look at Nigeria. I can go on. Do we really want to build the constitutional future of Cyprus on two forms of nationalism and on a concept that fuels nationalism, especially in view of the history that we've had on this island, where nationalism has given rise to countless deaths of people from all backgrounds, of all faiths, of all ethnicities? That's why I come back to my primary argument. The future of Cyprus must rest not on bicommunalism, but on the concept of one island, one people, one community, one parliament, one government, one judiciary, one public service, and one united, integrated population where everybody adheres to the rule of law, the principles of liberal democracy, secularism, pluralism, and a dedication to upholding the fundamental, honourable and ethical values of the country. What will be the honourable, ethical, fundamental values of a bicommunal, bizonal federation? I nearly said a bizonal, bicommunal separation, but that's essentially what it is. The values are them and us. The values are Greeks and Turks. The values are separate but equal. The values are division. And that, in my view, is a bleak, dishonourable, unethical, unconscionable, unfair, and morally repugnant objective. Why has bicommunalism emerged as the constitutional pillar of the Republic of Cyprus, if we think of it of 1960, and why is bicommunalism one of the pillars of the joint statement and of the UN Security Council resolutions? The answer is complex, but it boils down to this. We need to understand pre-1960 history. Bicommunalism owes its origins to the Ottoman conquest of Cyprus and the practices of the Ottoman Empire. But in more recent times, the idea of bicommunalism and bizonality owes its origins to British Imperial India. In the last days of British Imperial India, or in the last years rather, of British Imperial India, the leader of the Muslim League of India, as it then was, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, a barrister by profession, member of Lincoln's Inn, came up with the idea that the Indian question, as it then was, should be settled by means of the creation of a, you guessed it, bicommunal, bizonal federation. He had in mind Hindustan, or a Hindustan zone for the Hindus, and a Pakistan zone primarily for Muslims. Now, I don't know to what extent Mr. Denktash was influenced by Jinnah. There's some reports that he liked to describe himself as the Jinnah of Cyprus. But Mr. Denktash went to Lincoln's Inn when he went to study law in the university in London, and he was called to the bar of Lincoln's Inn. And as I understand it, he was at Lincoln's Inn from 1944 to 1947, in the last 3 years of British rule in India. So I asked the question, to what extent was Mr. Denktash influenced by the philosophy of Jinnah and the idea of a bicommunal, bizonal federation in India, British Imperial India? Nothing came of that, of course, and India ended up being, or British Imperial India rather, ended up being partitioned into various parts. Now, I'm not making any apology for going into this history, because I know the diplomats don't like us dredging up history, but because it's inconvenient and it obstructs what the diplomats want to do, which is to reach a settlement and sort of move on and earn a Nobel Peace Prize. But I'm mentioning the history because if you read Aristotle, he says you can't understand anything unless you go back to the beginning and examine how and why that thing began, how it was conceived, how it developed, and how it emerged, how it was born, and so on. As far as Cyprus is concerned, the immediate origins of what we might term Republican bicommunalism, that's to say post-1960 bicommunalism, that form of bicommunalism owes its origins to two people, really, among others. Professor Nihat Erim, who was the Turkish constitutional scholar who was an advisor to Mr. Menderes, the Prime Minister of Turkey from 1950 until 1960. And the other one is Fatih Zorlu, who was the Foreign Secretary or Foreign Minister of Turkey during the final part of the 50s. Now, I owe a great deal to Christo Yagovu and Neo Glissari and others who've written about Nihat Erim. I don't read Turkish, so I can't really translate his work, so I'm reliant on the works of people like Christo Yagovu. And what emerges from those analyses is that Nihat Erim came up with what might be termed the 5 pillars of partition. And one of the 5 pillars of partition was the notion that in Cyprus there are 2, and no more than 2, communities. Now, Erim came up with this idea in 1956 with 2 reports he furnished to Mr. Menderes. So the idea that we have 2 communities in Cyprus owes its immediate origins to 1956. Then Mr. Zorlu comes into the picture as a foreign minister, and in 1958 he starts, this is at the back end of British imperial rule here in Cyprus, he comes together with the Greek foreign minister, Mr. Averov, and Mr. Zorlu persuades Mr. Averov to create an independent, so-called independent, in fact, if the word independent didn't appear in the Zurich Agreement, forgive me, to establish a bicommunal state of Cyprus. And Mr. Averov, wittingly or unwittingly, accepted that premise. So we ended up with the Zurich Agreement, which was predicated on the creation of a bicommunal state, and that was presented as an agreement to the British. The British agreed it, subject to the retention of the sovereign base areas and the retention of Cyprus as a base, which is another story, but not for today. And we ended up with a London conference, and the idea of a bicommunal state was presented as a non-negotiable fait accompli to Archbishop Margarios and Mr. Dr. Kuchuk, and they were invited to rubber stamp the Zurich-London agreements, which they did after a bit of a delay. And the very fact that you had, there we have them, the very fact that you had an archbishop as the head of the community is sort of a manifestation of bicommunalism and a defeat for secularism. Now, I'm not making a criticism of Archbishop Margarios. He was a product of Ottomanism and bicommunalism. And of course, he had a vested interest in not having a secular Republic of Cyprus, because if he'd have insisted on there being a secular Republic of Cyprus, he wouldn't have become president. That's another story. The point I'm making is that Mr. Zorlu insisted on there being a bicommunal Republic of Cyprus. Now, when the Zurich-London agreements were finalised, they needed to be approved by the British Parliament, so they were presented to the British Parliament, and the Cyprus bill was presented to Parliament. Interestingly enough, when India became independent, it became independent under the India Independence Act. When Malaya became independent, it was the Malaya Independence Act. Burma became independent under the Burma Independence Act. Nigeria, which became independent on the same day as Cyprus, was established under the Nigeria Independence Act. Cyprus was established under the Cyprus Act. Now, we shouldn't read too much into the title of an Act of Parliament, but it's quite interesting that in the history of British decolonisation, Cyprus came into existence as a bicommunal republic in accordance with an Act of Parliament that omitted the word independence from the title. Now, why is all this relevant? Because when the Cyprus bill was presented to Parliament with all of the supporting papers, a number of members of Parliament in the House of Commons and House of Lords, as the British tend to do, raised their eyebrows. They were puzzled as to why a bicommunal republic was going to be established. And I know he's not very popular in Cyprus, but we have to give credit to Field Marshal the Lord Harding of Petherton, because Field Marshal the Lord Harding, the penultimate governor of Cyprus, who objected to partition, by the way, stood up in the House of Lords and said, hang on a second, why are we talking about two communities? There are more than two communities in Cyprus. He clearly had in mind the Armenians, the Maronites, the Latins, perhaps the Roma and the few Jews and British who were scattered around the place. But Field Marshal Harding spotted that there was something wrong with this. And indeed, in the aftermath of the Turkish invasion, he wrote a letter to the Spectator in which he made the very same point, and by the way, called for the establishment of a unitary Republic of Cyprus. I think Governor Harding, I'm going to get into trouble for here, but he's not quite the devil that he's sometimes made out. I'm just going to make that point in a very careful way. The point I'm trying to bring across, though, is Governor Harding, or ex-Governor Harding, spotted there was something wrong. He smelt a rat. And up stood Julian Amery, the British minister, and said, I'm terribly sorry, but there are two communities because Turkey has insisted that there are two communities, and Mr. Averov in Zurich agreed. So we have bicommunalism at the insistence of Zorlu at Zurich and at the insistence of Nihat Erim in 1956. So when you see the word bicommunalism in the joint statement, it's a legacy of imperialism, Turkish imperialism and British imperialism, and it's a direct product of the Zurich Agreement. These are not reunification talks in Nicosia, because you cannot reunify something that wasn't unified in the first place. It stands to reason, doesn't it? If the Republic of Cyprus was established, split down the middle, with a form of what I describe as constitutional and administrative partition in 1960, how can you reunify that? It's a false premise. So these are not reunification talks. And that we don't even need to go to bizonality, because how can you reunify something by splitting it into four? That's another matter. The point I'm trying to bring across to you is that what we need in the Republic of Cyprus, and I'm sorry to say this, is we need a peaceful, non-violent, second decolonization campaign. And I say that with Malta partly in mind. Malta has two independent states. The first was when marks when Malta was established as an independent state, and the second date is when the British left in 1979. I'm not calling for the British to leave, don't misunderstand me, because there may be, I'm in favour of Anglo-Cypriot relations, and there may be a way in which the British sovereign base areas can be folded into the security structures of the Republic of Cyprus. I'm making the point, with regard to decolonisation, that the Republic of Cyprus is still under colonial rule. In the north, in the occupied, we call it the occupied area, which it is, but it's a colonised area. It's to all intents and purposes, a colony of Turkey. So we need a decolonisation effort in relation to the occupied area. But we also need what is more subtle than that, a constitutional and an administrative decolonisation process to weed out of the Republic of Cyprus the traces of imperialism which are embodied within the concept of bicommunalism. I hope that makes sense. I'll just move on, and I'm conscious of the time. I'll get 10 minutes, that's good. That brings me to I can't leave this talk without saying something about bizonality, because bizonality is a counterpart to bicommunalism. Remember, in 1960, what the Turkey achieved, and it was a diplomatic triumph, what Turkey achieved in 1960 was the constitutional and administrative partition of Cyprus with the full force of law, and with the approval of Archbishop Magarios and Dr. Kutchuk and the British and the Greeks and the Turks. There was constitutional and administrative partition in 1960. And what Turkey managed to achieve de facto in 1974 was the counterpart to constitutional and administrative partition, which is geographical partition, demographic partition, and thus segregation or apartheid. Take your pick. The negotiations here in Nicosia, in my view, are not a reunification process. They're not really a peace process unless you look at the ancient Greek definition of peace. And there are two versions of peace in ancient Greek. I'll let you look it up afterwards and you'll see what I mean. It's not really a peace process. It's a surrender process. And the objective is not the formulation of a settlement plan. The objective is the composition of an instrument of surrender. Why do I say that? The British, and I'm British and I love the British, they are experts at washing their dirty linen in public. That's why we have inquiries where we discover all the dirty linen. You know, it sometimes takes a while for stuff to come out. We have a Freedom of Information Act now. We discovered the other day what Prince Charles was saying to ministers behind the scenes, because we have a Freedom of Information Act and various other legislation. And we have a National Archive. And I'm a historian as well as a law lecturer. And the British have published the document, or many of the documents from 1974. The Foreign Office has published them. And I've been to the archives many times, but I'll just read to you just a couple of documents from 1974 which explain to us what Turkey's objectives were before the invasion. So let me just give you 2 or 3 examples, and then I'll close. The first example, and I haven't even, before we get there, yeah, I'll come to that later. Actually, I'll do it now. I should have said this earlier. I'm going to rewind. Bicommunalism, of course, is a variant of separate but equal, which was the discredited constitutional doctrine of apartheid in South Africa and segregation in America. And hopefully those 2 images make that point for me. Because what the Turkish invasion has done is it's produced segregation, and it has enabled the separate but equal doctrine to be potentially applicable by law in Cyprus, subject to a signature. Here's the first document. It's a letter from the British High Commissioner, Mr. Olver, to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office on the 27th of February 1974. And the British High Commissioner is reporting upon his conversation with a Mr. Inhan, the Deputy Head of Mission at the Turkish Embassy in Nicosia. This is before the invasion. What were Turkey's objectives in February 1974? A bicommunal state. So not the annexation of Cyprus or the conquest of Cyprus, a bicommunal state. B, a federal system, or to call a spade, federation. C, federation cannot admittedly work without a geographical base, therefore some degree of transfer of population might be involved. So bizonality requires a bicommunal state, a federal system, otherwise known as federation, and a geographical base, and a geographical base requires a transfer of population. And in these Turkish areas, there would be a completely self-contained and autonomous Turkish administration from the district officer downwards, and this in turn must be responsible to a self-contained central Turkish administration. So you need a central Turkish administration, or as it's transpired, a state in the occupied area. The result would be a federal state of Cyprus, independent, supposedly, sovereign, perhaps with guarantees for its future by Turkey and Greece. This could not come about overnight, the High Commissioner concludes, and intercommunal talks were of course useful in the meanwhile. So before the invasion, this was what Turkey had in mind. And I'll just read to you the second document. There are others. I could spend all night reading to you these documents, but the second one involves Kyrynĩa. And as I'm in the organisation representing the refugees from Kyrynĩa, I ought to read this to you. It sent a shiver down my spine, and it reinforced to me how unjust and unethical and morally repugnant bisonality is in terms of its origins. Remember Aristotle? Look at the origins of something. This is what we mean by bisonality in terms of its spiritual and its moral basis. So the High Commissioner, Mr. Olver, reporting to the Foreign Office on the 5th of August 1974, so between the first and second phases of the invasion. The High Commissioner, the British High Commissioner, writes, "A transfer of the Greek Cypriot population out of the Kyrynĩa area is going on steadily. This is undoubtedly considered Turkish policy, and people are being told that they will never come back. This is tragic, and we must obviously do what we can to contest these forced evictions. In the long run, however, a Kyrynĩa province largely populated by Turkish Cypriots, with the rest of the island mainly Greek Cypriot, might be communally more stable than the present situation, provided that programme of voluntary transfer, once things settle down, would not necessarily be a bad thing." And on he goes in a similar vein. "A fully federal solution is clearly the least that the Turks will accept. Many Turks here, including Mr. Denktash, openly bemoan the slowness of their generals in not grabbing more land." That, ladies and gentlemen, is the moral basis of bisonality. It rests on the crime of forced eviction of people from their homes. It rests on war crimes, crimes against humanity, and arguably genocide. What has befallen the Kyrynians in this room and the other refugees in this room is a crime. And what bisonality is trying to do is to lend a facade of legitimacy to the consequences of crime. And that is why it's morally repugnant and objectionable, and why it cannot be improved upon. I'm going to come to a close in a moment or two, but I can't leave this subject. There, of course, are some of the refugees from 74. Kurt Waldheim was brought onto the scene after 1974 to lend legitimacy to this. Remember, the British support, I regret to say this, and I think it's a stain on the conscience of the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom endorsed the establishment of a bi-communal, bizonal federation. Dr. Kissinger rode on the back of that. It wasn't the other way around. It was Dr. Kissinger rode on the back of the British support for a bi-communal, bizonal federation. And of course, the British rode on the back of the Turks. The Secretary-General of the United Nations from 1972 until 1981 was Dr. Kurt Waldheim. He came here, and many of you will remember him, and hope was pinned on him as the guardian of the rule of law, as the custodian of human rights, as the representative of everything that is good and noble about the 1945 generation that created the United Nations Charter to put a stop to invasion, occupation, ethnic cleansing, colonization, racism, discrimination, brutality, and so on. And I remember my relatives saying, Mr. Waldheim is coming to help us. And Mr. Waldheim, or Dr. Waldheim as he was, came to Cyprus, and he failed to disclose that he had a conflict of interest, or the appearance of a conflict of interest. Why? He had served as a Wehrmacht intelligence officer in the German zone of occupation in Yugoslavia, and in the German zone of occupation in Greece. He may not have committed any crimes when he was there, but he was there at a time when war crimes were being committed, when the Holocaust was unfolding, and when people were being butchered and sent to death camps because of their race or religion. And this gentleman came to Cyprus, and he, insofar as I am aware, failed to make a declaration of interest. So when you hear about bicommunal, bizonal federation, it's partly thanks to this man that it attracted and obtained the legitimacy that comes with being supported by the Secretary General of the United Nations. I make no criticism in this lecture of his successors, but I do make a fierce criticism of Dr. Waldheim for failing to disclose his Nazi or association with the Third Reich through the Wehrmacht. He secured a doctorate from the University of Vienna in 1944, a doctorate in jurisprudence, in law. His PhD thesis was focusing in part on federalism and how federalism might be used to enable a great power, such as Germany, to control territories beyond its borders, as I understand it. And I don't read German, so I haven't been able to read his thesis, but that's my understanding. Did Dr. Waldheim disclose the contents of his doctoral thesis when he was coming here and pushing federalism? I asked those questions, and I would like to have an answer, but I'm writing a little short book, 100-page book, where I'll try and explore some of these topics in more detail. I now come to my conclusions, and before I do, there's one final footnote to this story. When the Republic of Cyprus was established in 1960, a Supreme Constitutional Court came to existence, and because of the nature of bicommunalism, nobody could believe in the independence or the impartiality of the judges who happened to be Greek or Turkish. So a so-called neutral judge had to be parachuted in to the Republic of Cyprus to act as the power broker, as it were. And who did they choose in 1960 to be parachuted in to be the first president of the Constitutional Court in Nicosia? Ernst Forsthoff, a professor of constitutional law in the University of Heidelberg, but more to the point, a former academic at the University of Vienna, where Dr. Waldheim secured his PhD, and worse than that, somebody who enthusiastically endorsed the arrival of Adolf Hitler in 1933 and even composed a book called The Total State to herald his arrival. And Ernst Forsthoff is a figure from history that you all need to be aware of, because when he encapsulates, Ernst Forsthoff, a Nazi, or ex-Nazi as he was described by some, Ernst Forsthoff encapsulates what's wrong with bicommunalism. It's associated with division and racism and discrimination. And Kurt Waldheim encapsulates what's wrong with bizonality. It's based on division, racism, and discrimination. Having descended into the depths of despair and into the swamp of immorality and the stench of segregation, let's clear the air. Dr. Martin Luther King earned the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964. He led the campaign for desegregation in the United States. And when he began his campaign, some of the Americans went up to him and said, you know what, we can't dismantle desegregation. We can't desegregate America because segregation is too deep-rooted. We cannot take on these big institutions, the southern states, the governors, the powerful people. We can't take them on. They're too powerful. Segregation is too deeply entrenched. All we can do is improve segregation. Let's try and improve the conditions of segregation. And Dr. King said, you can't improve something that's morally repugnant. And he led the inspirational campaign to desegregate the United States. And if you go into the library of the Supreme Court of the United Kingdom, as I've been privileged to do, you'll see carved into the woodwork a phrase from Martin Luther King, and it's the opening sentence that I've put on the screen for you here. It's from his letter from Birmingham jail of 16th of April 1963. Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. The Genignoders in this room are the victims of an injustice. The other refugees are the victims of an injustice. Anybody here in this island who's had a relative murdered or has been uprooted from their home, whatever their race or religion, they are victims of an injustice. And the injustice will perpetuate for as long as bicommunalism perpetuates. I'm going to close with Dr. Martin Luther King. I'm going to adapt his words from his speech in the Capitol in Washington on the 28th of August 1963. So this is my adaptation of the I Have a Dream speech. Let us not wallow in the valley of despair. Even though we face the difficulties of today and tomorrow, we still have a dream. We have a dream that one day each citizen of Cyprus will live in an island, their island, where they will not be judged by their ethnicity or their religion, but by the content of their character. And if Cyprus is to be great, this must become true.